Hello, my name is Theopisti Stylianou-Lambert, and based on the results of my PhD research, I will present here today how art museum visitors and non-visitors draw symbolic boundaries in order to distinguish themselves from others. In this presentation, I will talk a little bit about the previous literature, the methodology used, and the main findings of this research when it comes to symbolic boundaries. I then will talk a little bit about the results. Michel Lamont defined symbolic boundaries as conceptual distinctions that we make to categorize objects, people, practices, and even time and space. She identifies three types of symbolic boundaries: moral, socioeconomic, and cultural. Cultural boundaries are defined in terms of education, manners, taste, and command of high culture, and this is what we're really examining here. One of the central concepts in Lamont's work is that symbolic boundaries presuppose a. the exclusion of the repulsive or impure, which results in a sense of distinction; b. the inclusion of the desirable, which results in a sense of belonging; and c. a gray area of elements that leave us indifferent. Of course, the process of exclusion and inclusion presupposes the presence of other people. The being of the self and the being of the other are interrelated, since identity is always constructed in relation to the other. Consumption of goods and leisure participation choices are active symbols, powerful enough to communicate individual or group identities. At the same time, these symbols can help individuals develop a sense of belonging with certain groups and a sense of distinction with others. Communities, and especially subcultures, depend on this process of identification and differentiation in order to create a sense of belonging for members and a sense of distinction from non-members. Interestingly, according to Kelly, leisure may be that life space in which identity is most fully expressed and developed. The purpose of this research was to explore and understand people's perceptions regarding art museums and galleries and the way these perceptions influence visitation decisions. In order to do that, I used semi-structured, in-depth interviews with 60 participants. All the interviews were conducted in 2006 in Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus. I used a theoretical sampling, which aimed at recruiting participants from all visitation levels, and thus the aim was not to have a representative sample of the population. Along with the 60 interviews, I used questionnaires to gather basic demographic characteristics and another method called personal meaning maps, which pretty much looks like the drawing on the right hand side. In a circle, I wrote art museum gallery, and then I asked participants to write or draw whatever came to their minds when they thought of these words. This was a very useful technique because it allowed time for reflection and discussion. The visitation categories used are the following ones. In the high visitation level, we included very frequent and frequent visitors, and 19 participants belonged in this visitation level. In the middle visitation group, we had occasional and rare visitors with 24 participants, and finally in the low visitation group we had rare and non-visitors, and we had 17 participants. Just a note, a visit was defined as any visit to an art museum, gallery, or other art exhibition space, whether in Cyprus or abroad. Now, to the main results. People in the high visitation level felt a sense of belonging with what they called the genuine art lovers, and thus they felt a sense of distinction from certain other visitors. For example, Elias, an art curator, mentioned, the 1%, the percentage of people who visit art museums in Cyprus, are people who have some higher culture, that is, some higher educational level. They have experiences abroad as well. They know. They have experiences with individuals who love museums. They learn to love museums through others. There is also a small group that wants to be elevated through art. You often see in exhibitions people that do not understand what they see and then just wander around, not because they love it. As we can see, Elias included himself in the 1% of Cypriots he considered educated, experienced, intellectual and sensitive, and at the same time excluded himself from other visitors who visited for mainly social reasons. The middle visitation level was considered a grey area of distinction and belonging, since it encompassed a multitude of attitudes. For example, Lucy explained that she places herself somewhere in between museum visitors and non-visitors. This intermediate positioning between people who are very interested in art and those who are not was actually quite common in interviewees who belonged in the middle visitation level. Placing themselves in the middle meant that they drew symbolic boundaries between museum visitors and non-visitors. Based on the research results, interviewees in the middle visitation level distinguished themselves from museum visitors in two distinct ways. They either saw their leisure priorities as different, or they did not want to be associated with certain snobbish visitors who visit in order to show off. They also distanced themselves from what they considered to be negative attributes of non-visitors, such as lack of interest in learning, lack of art appreciation, or lack of education. When it comes to the low visitation level, people usually define themselves in opposition to museum visitors. Art museum visitors were described in four main ways: as art professionals and their friends, tourists and students, rich people who can afford to buy artworks, or people who want to show off. This is an example of a personal mini-map drawn by a rare visitor. He wrote, "Paintings, high society snobs. The painter wanders around dressed weirdly, low lighting and few people." It is obvious from this personal mini-map that this rare visitor tried to distinguish himself from who he considered to be a museum visitor. Apart from distinguishing themselves from museum visitors, interviewees in the low visitation level felt that they identified with the majority of people who happened to be non-visitors. For example, Emily identified with the simple people, or most Cypriots. She said, "I don't think that simple people visit such places often. I don't know, that's what I believe. It's a fact, as Cypriots, the last thing that occupies us is to visit an art museum. This is the honest truth. Whoever you ask, most people will say that they have visited only with school." This feeling of belonging was a safe feeling, since rare and non-visitors felt that the majority of people behaved and thought the same way they did. This gave them the sense that museum visitors were the different ones, the minority, the other, and therefore that their decision not to visit could not be seriously wrong. This table outlines what we just talked about. Interestingly, the interviewees in the high visitation level were less concerned with distinguishing themselves from non-visitors than from other kinds of visitors. The interviewees in the middle visitation level were caught in a grey area of distinction and belonging. Because they did not strongly identify with museum visitors or non-visitors, they negotiated an intermediate position by distinguishing themselves from the negative attitudes they projected on the other two groups and by associating themselves with the positive ones. In the low visitation level, the feeling of belonging was not with an exclusive small group, but with the majority, the simple people. Interviewees in this level clearly tried to distinguish themselves from museum visitors by attributing to them roles they themselves did not accept or characteristics they did not share. We have seen that museum visitation decisions offer opportunities for drawing symbolic boundaries and thus help define one's identity. The groups we see ourselves belonging to and therefore performing for, as well as those we try to distinguish ourselves from, inform us and others about who we are. Thank you very much for listening.